This episode breaks with the pattern of the show in two ways. A few weeks ago, after 8 years of being a weekly show, The Seen and the Unseen went fortnightly. Well, because of the topicality of the issue I tackle today, this episode comes just a week after the last one. But I go back to fortnightly now, and the next episode will be 2 weeks from now. My YouTube show, Everything is Everything, is still weekly, of course. The second way in which I'm breaking the pattern is that after a long time, I talk about one single subject today. This podcast started as an exploration of individual policies, which would often last less than an hour, to deep dives into subjects, which could last 3 hours or more, to deep dives into people akin to oral histories, and those go on for many hours. My longest episode is 12 hours. I've got 7 episodes over 8 hours, and that's actually one reason why I went fortnightly. I love doing it, but it was just so much work and so intense. But I decided to do a subject-based episode this week because A, the subject was in the news, B, my two guests today had different and well thought out views on it, and C, they're both awesome thinkers and regulars on this show. So a perfect storm. I enjoyed doing this episode. It felt just like the good old days. And I wonder if you want more of these from me. Let me know.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guests today are Pranay, Kotasthane and Raghu Jaitley aka RSJ, who write the brilliant newsletter Anticipating the Unintended at publicpolicy.substack.com. Earlier this week, our Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced his support for a caste census. The opposition had been demanding it for a while, the ruling party had been against it, so this turn of events was interesting. Pranay and RSJ in their newsletter had a debate on this last September, and I'd loved that post, and I managed to agree with both of them. Now, they've both written on this subject extensively in the past, so I invited them over, and we discussed the caste census in particular and reservations in caste in general. Now, there are a couple of issues all three of us want to get out of the way before we begin. Number one, people might want to know our caste and say that we cannot discuss this subject if we are Savarna. That's a valid point, but in the wrong context. I agree that if we discuss the lived experience of Dalits, then only Dalits should speak on that and the rest of us should pass the mic. But if we talk about public policy or economics, whether this measure works, what that data indicates, then all of us have the right to make our points. The three of us have been writing about these subjects for a combined 50 years now. You should then look at our arguments on their own merits. Our identity is irrelevant. Number two, I've noticed that on social media especially, where many prefer simple narratives to a complex discourse, people often focus on the person and not the argument, and ascribe intent and malice to you if you make a point they disagree with. For example, if you express reservations about reservations, it is automatically assumed that you must be casteist. But that's not necessarily so. It is possible to be anti-caste and yet believe that reservations are an imperfect solution that have been politicized. So I will ask you, gentle listeners, to listen to us in good faith and take our words at face value. Regular listeners already know how much I despise the caste system, which I keep ranting against, and some have even attacked me as anti-Hindu. Let me reiterate that and say just one thing about all three of us. We are all anti-caste and consider it the deepest evil of our society. And our discourse around it needs to go beyond posturing and virtue signaling. We need more good faith discussions on the subject. One thing we can't deny is this: 78 years after independence, we are very far from the annihilation of caste. We need to understand why. Before we get to the conversation though, I want to plug the Takshashila Institute's postgraduate program in public policy, a 48-week program that starts in June. Pranay works at Takshashila and is one of the teachers for this course. And both Pranay and RSJ are alumni of Takshashila. If you care about public policy, I recommend this highly. Check out more details at school.takshashila.org.in/pgp. I'll link it from the show notes. And now, let's head to the conversation. But before that, a quick commercial break. Hey, the music started and this sounds like a commercial, but it isn't. It's a plea from me to check out my latest labor of love, a YouTube show I am co-hosting with my good friend, the brilliant Ajay Shah. We've called it Everything is Everything. Every week, we'll speak for about an hour on things we care about, from the profound to the profane, from the exalted to the everyday. We range widely across subjects and we bring multiple frames with which we try to understand the world. Please join us on our journey and please support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. The show is called Everything is Everything. Please do check it out. Pranay and Harishche, welcome to the Scene and the Unseen.
Hi Amit, good to be back.
Good to be back, Amit. Hi.
So I'm really happy to have you. This is one of those Scene Unseens, which is kind of topical. Typically, I tend to do timeless episodes, and I'm hoping this will be timeless as well. But it's sparked by the topicality of Prime Minister Modi announcing that there is going to be a caste enumeration that is going to be done soon, surprising many people because, hey, it was really Rahul Gandhi in the opposition which was demanding a caste census quite vociferously. So how come this shift has happened? Before we start, I kind of want to set the context for people who may be from abroad and therefore may not be aware of the entire context of what we are talking about. Set a context of caste in India and how, the policies that have formed around it over time, and a quick potted history to bring you up to current times. Caste, as all of us would agree, is one of the original sins of Indian society, as I've kept saying for many years. And this is something that you find not just in the historic record, but the genetic record. One of the great TILs that hit me during this show was when I did an episode with Tony Joseph, who wrote the great book Early Indians. And Tony Joseph, in that, looks at the genetic data and, shows how India was essentially partying till about 2000 years ago. Partying in the sense that all the people who came here in the different migrations were mingling with each other, and it was an awesome, inclusive society. But something happened around 2000 years ago where a particular ideological strand from the Gangetic belt took over, and you had severe caste endogamy being practiced, which means people only marry within their own caste. And the genetic record shows this to such an extent that there is a great quote by David Reich that if you're looking for a large population, you need to look at the Han Chinese. India is really a collection of many small populations, and this is deeply and terribly tragic in a variety of ways. What this caste endogamy also affects is that it increases the drive towards female seclusion. As I had a great episode with Alice Evans where we discussed this, and it's been discussed in many other episodes, where obviously if you have such severe endogamy, you want to control women's sexuality, and therefore what they do outside the home is curtailed, and it just goes all the way down the line. So caste very much a deep reality of Indian society. At the same time, as my recent episode with Manu Pillai shows, Hinduism was a kind of a very open source religion also for the last 2000 years, constantly adaptive, different things happening, except for this caste endogamy, which wasn't really affected by it. Now, when the British came here, what they kind of did was they tried to understand the country through the prisms of their interlocutors, and the interlocutors happened to be upper caste Brahmins, so their understanding of the country was a particular understanding, which was very Manusmriti and caste-based and all of that, and therefore that became part of the way they looked at the country, a sort of a simplifying narrative in a deeply complex space. And from 1881 onwards, they started doing a census which included caste. Like 1872, there was a partial census, but from 1881, every 10 years, they did a kind of census. And in 1901, in fact, there was a little bit of a controversy because the census head, H.S. Risley, attempted to rank the caste 1, 2, 3, 4, and there was political uproar saying ki hamari ranking aapne galat di, and etc., which just tells you the complexities and the political repercussions. And what their censuses also, their caste census also ran into the criticism of actually hardening identities, right? And there's a great quote I like by Peter Gottschalk, where Peter Gottschalk Chalk talks about how classifications of convenience for government officials transformed into contested identities for the Indian public, as the census went from an enumerative exercise of the British government to an authoritative representation of the social body and a vital tool of indigenous interests. Stop quote. And this is all pre-independence talk, but you see how the same issues can apply today. That are you merely gathering data, or is there a political purpose or an inevitable political consequence of gathering that data? So you could argue that these policies of the British both exploited and mitigated caste divisions at the same time. Now, after independence, you had a move led by Ambedkar and others to do something about these deep inequalities that ran through Indian society, and therefore you had reservations coming in. And these reservations gained a political tint when the Mandal Commission was set up in 1980, and in 1990 the Mandal Commission was put into force and OBC reservations became a thing, and you had the increasing politicization of caste. Now, since then, you had two interesting things happen. The first of them is never mentioned when you talk about the history of caste in India, but I think it is super important. That's the 91 reforms. The 1991 reforms brought millions of people out of hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, including a large section of Dalits. And most importantly, it showed that society is not a zero-sum game where you need to redistribute either wealth or opportunity. And, that is a big lesson that you get from there. In fact, thinking of the empowerment of Dalits, I often make the controversial statement that Manmohan Singh did as much for India's Dalits as Ambedkar did, and both are great heroes of mine. I had an episode with the Dalit scholar Chandraban Prasad where he asserted that his two heroes were Ambedkar and Adam Smith, which shows the power of markets happening. And really that period of growth was between 91 and 2011. I'm being party agnostic when I say that we haven't had the best time of it since then as far as the economy is concerned. The second thing that happened perhaps over the last 10-12 years, where the BJP managed to consolidate the Hindu vote. RLJ, in earlier pieces you have in fact written about the cohering versus centrifugal forces, that what the BJP attempted to do was cohere all these caste identities and build one Hindu vote, whereas there was also at the same time a natural centrifugal tendency to the other direction. But for a long time, between 2014 and 2024, it seemed that the BJP had succeeded. And they succeeded partly using caste. Prashant Jha, in his great book on how the BJP won on 2014, talks about how, they went to UP and they attempted to play upon resentment within Dalits by getting non-Dalit Jatavs to vote against the Jatavs, and getting non-Yadav OBCs to vote against the Yadavs. In Maharashtra, non-Maratha OBCs to vote against them, etc., etc. But regardless, the fact remains that in 2014 and 2019, in those general elections, more Dalits voted for the BJP than for any other party. The great Dalit scholar Badri Narayan, who has a bunch of books on Dalit politics in India, and I'll link them from the show notes, in fact referred to the BJP as a default Dalit party of India. In all of this time, in these 10 years, Rahul Gandhi was coming up and making a cry saying we need a caste system and talking more and more about caste, while the BJP, of course, their project was the opposite. Unite the Hindu vote and then do your anti-Muslim politics or anti-other politics or whatever the case might be, and they kept speaking against it. Now, these lines aren't drawn in sand. The Atal Bihari Vajpayee Ministry of Social Justice, in fact, had first come out and suggested a caste census. When there was a debate in the Lok Sabha in 2010, the BJP was for a caste census and Manmohan was dithering. As recently as 2018, Rajnath Singh in fact said that there will be, in the next census, where typically SC, ST identities are asked for, they will also ask for OBC identities. So these are not lines drawn in sand, but over the last few years, what you have had is the opposition demanding a caste census to expand reservations, which is something they've been very clear about, especially for OBCs, and the government saying that no, this will be divisive, etc., etc., except that just a day ago, and we are recording this on May 1st, just a day ago, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that there will indeed be a caste census, at which point, what do I do to make make sense of all of this, I go on Twitter. Just joking, I don't go on Twitter to make sense of anything. It's an addiction. And I came across, my favorite public intellectual, Pranay Kotasthane, Twitter account, where he tweeted to an excellent edition of the newsletter he writes with RHA. And it was written in, this particular piece was written in September 2024. And they were essentially on opposite sides of this issue, which fascinated me. Both were making great arguments. I found myself agreeing with both of them and finding it making sense. And then I read up more. I looked at Pranay's earlier pieces. I looked at where RHJ had written on the subject before, and I thought that, okay, let's do an episode. Let us go through all the different points of view. And sorry, this has ended up being a bit of a longish monologue, but I wanted to kind of set this context. If I have missed anything that you guys feel is important to shed clarity as we lay ground for the debate, please let me know. But this is broadly where I'd say we stand at this moment.
Yeah. Amit, if I could add some more context to this story. Even before independence, there was a move towards giving some more electoral representation in one way or the other. Some states and princely states were already doing that, like in Kolhapur, etc. But at the national level, the demand for reservations for electoral representation began. There was a lot of talk in 1910s, 1916s, around that period, and there was this earlier idea was actually to have separate electorates, and that was what the Britishers were also willing to encourage, right? Because that worked in their scheme of things as well. But then there was this Pune Pact, where it was agreed that there will not be separate electorates, but there will be reservations instead for electoral representation, right? So separate electorates meant that only persons of particular caste could vote for people of that particular caste, whereas reservations mean that only the person who's going to contest is going to be representing from a particular caste. So seats will be reserved for particular caste, but all the people who vote can be across castes. So that was the difference. And on the caste census thing, other important points are that it's not true that caste was not enumerated since 1931. Since 1931, the full, if the caste, if the census officer comes to us, they will ask that whether do you belong to SC, ST or not. And within SC, ST, there are more sub-classifications right down to the jati. So that was already happening since 1931, and it still continued. The only thing what this caste census is doing, that it will ask everyone about their caste, about their jatis. It's not just for SC, ST. So that was one thing. This was 1931. After independence, electoral representation reservations had already been agreed to since Pune Pact. After independence, it was also applied to government jobs and government educational institutions. Now, there's a big misconception of that many people have, that it was agreed that reservations will only last for 10 years. That's not the case. The 10-year thing applied to the electoral representation thing, that we will reconsider after 10 years. But there was no such limit applied for governmental educational institutions and jobs. So that was the fact. And yeah, that was the beginning. And then you had the Mandal Commission, which said, let's use reservation for more purposes. So the purpose itself changed, that it was no longer about correcting historical wrongs, but it was also for reducing relative deprivation. And then reservations got applied to a larger set of people, and that was what came into being in August 1990. After that, there was the Indra Sawhney judgment in 1993, which said that okay, you can have reservations, but it put some limit, that there should be 50% limit on total reservations. And there is no logical justification to this, just the fact that 50% sounds like a decent number. You can say that half the seats are general and half the seats have some particular category reservations. So that is like the past history of this that I wanted to add.
Sounds amazing. There's one element of the context that I want you guys to fill me up on, or at least what your theories are, or what your sense of it is, which is that why now? Why this about turn by the Prime Minister? Because that whole tussle over the last few years appears to have been a tussle of, on the one side, the consolidation of the vote, and therefore you don't want to get into issues of caste and reservation and all of that. And on the other side, this was a way out for the Congress. So, what has kind of changed now, or what could have changed now? Because I mean, we can't possibly know for sure that the wind has turned. Like RHA, you wrote this in your newsletter in September. You wrote about that RSS convention where the RSS actually said that we need this caste enumeration, and that kind of made it a done deal that is going to happen at some point in time. So, give me a sense of how we make sense of why now, why this.
Yeah, I think the RSS convention was the time, and when I read through the note that they had, it was quite clear that this will happen, and I was quite certain it won't happen immediately. There will be enough of op-eds and other things which will satisfy the core in terms of saying why this is a bad idea. And then, sometime maybe 7-8 months later, they will slip this in. Now, why now? See, the force of what you are trying to stop is politically not going to be beneficial to you, because eventually this idea that you are stopping something which will show that there are more claimants and there have been, in some sense, wrongful, divvying up of benefits in the past, which also needs to be corrected. Even the recent past, since when there has been reservations, and let's use reservations right now very broadly as a substitute for benefit. I think all of this would continue to gain, it would be a political snowball that will continue to gain both mass and momentum. So they knew this, that they were on a weak wicket, and that was amply shown to them during the 2024 election. The ability to use that BJP is out there to change the constitution. I mean, that whole thing was about about BJP being against reservation. And therefore, every single month, every single election, you would find this as a bit of a uphill battle to say that we are against this, we won't do this. So that's one. Second, I also think that what individual states started doing, they couldn't call it census because census can only be done by the central authority. But they started calling it surveys of different kinds and names, and eventually started publishing the results of it, right? So you had Bihar start off with that, and you had Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Odisha also has done something of that kind. And the results of those eventually get placed in the local or the state legislation, in the state assembly. So people have now started seeing some of those results, and people often contest that, which will happen if you do the overall census as well. But then those results are out there, and therefore, it's better to take the initiative and show that we have ourselves decided to do it centrally, than for individual states and their chief ministers and different political parties claim that they actually got this done and put further pressure on this idea of, jitni jansankhya, utni bhagedari, utna hak, and all of that. So I think those are the things. Extreme political expediency could be, this is possibly a time when there are other things also that is bothering the government. So let's put this into the mix and see what we can, do in terms of some amount of distraction. But that would have only meant a month or two here or there. This was going to come up, in September was the RSS meet. The next RSS meet is going to be in September again. So it was this 12-month window when this would have happened.
I would add one more thing to this, there is, I think, Roshan Kishore in HT had a very nice article about the Justice Rohini Commission, which has been established by this government in 2017, which tries to stratify OBC as a group as well, right? And the report apparently is completed and pending. So there might be, the government also might be trying to create reservation within reservation, and I'm sure there will be people trying to do numerical calculations about if what will help their own electoral fortune. So that might also be a big role here. By the way, this government, I don't think, is opposing reservations, because they have also given this economically weaker sections reservation in 2019. It's just on what basis should it be done is a different thing. So it looks like reservation as a policy instrument, everyone believes in that, even though it's like we should question that, but looks like everyone believes. It's just now people are thinking, how should that be divided? So that is one thing. And incidentally, last year in there was a 7-judge bench of the Supreme Court which had permitted subclassification for scheduled caste and scheduled tribes in reservations by state governments. So I think they also want to apply the same thing for OBCs also. Probably that's why this becomes relevant in the context of the upcoming Bihar elections also.
See, the point on this government or any other government since the time Mandal came in, it's almost impossible for any government to be against reservation. The core challenge for BJP is this idea of having consolidated the Hindu vote base. Will something like this create that kind of disaggregation that they saw through the 90s, which worked in the favor of smaller regional parties, caste-based parties, and broadly what you might today call the different constituents of UPA. And that has nothing to do with, even if they give the reservations, the idea that you have this kind of a base, which is different from sometimes what the original narrative was about what different castes and subcaste groups actually were as a part of population, is one of the challenges, because then it gives a very different dimension to those groups, their leaders, in terms of how they would want to see themselves politically. Whether they believe standing for that particular subcaste group will give them better both economic benefits at a group level and at an individual level, than to go and align themselves with a larger single unitary behemoth which stands for a consolidated Hindu vote base, right? So the outcome of this from a reservation and all of that, we shall see. But I think even there the script is somewhat written, because if this happens maybe 5 years from now or whenever, we will have a census done, we will have some of those data come out, and then there will be broadly an all-party consensus to go back on and change the law in order to make sure that you are able to breach that 50% which came through Justice Indira Sawhney's judgment. All of that will happen. The problem here is politically, what would this mean, at least for BJP? And in that sense, it's a bit of a risk. But I think they have weighed this and they have decided that it's better to go with it and then see how in the new reality, we will manage and we'll figure our way out in terms of finding ways to win elections. And also, in all of this, there is always this core question of who is it who wants to do this, right? I mean, and so BJP would like to show that they are doing it because they truly believe in this, and then take whatever downstream benefits of it are. You mentioned Risley of in 1901. Again, that guy he used to study race scientifically. He was one of those eugenics kind of a guy. So for him, the fact that Indians had so many long years and centuries of endogamy meant that caste is almost like as good a data set for race that he would have got anywhere in the world. And therefore, the idea of getting those 7 or 6 or whatever those numbers in order, in hierarchical order, was largely his personal motivation to study and confirm certain racial biases or certain racial hypotheses that he had. which also applies to the guy who did the 1931 census, whoever was the chief census officer, which was a guy called John Hutton, another anthropologist who spent a lot of time studying various kinds of tribes and populations and subpopulations, trying to understand what does that mean in terms of their inherent traits, their acquired traits, and their ability to be socially mobile and things of that kind. So in that sense, we'll see the next chapter of the story as and when this unfolds.
I'm going to think aloud for a moment because it seems to me that this moment is not just about one political tactical move, but it's a deeply existential moment for the BJP across a couple of dimensions. Dimension one is a question that I've raised in past episodes where I talk about the necessary trade off between being true to whatever your core beliefs are and the will to power. And if you are a political party, you have to cater to the will to power. I mean, I've brought this question up in the past in a completely different context. In the context of, for example, wooing people from other parties to make up the numbers in a particular state, and that is purely playing for the will to power and the will to win and nothing to do with your core ideology. And here what I see is that at one level their core ideology has been to say that Hindus are Hindus and the other, as it were, are Muslims, etc., and we will consolidate the caste identity, and that seems to have been a sort of a core belief of theirs since the foundation of the RSS, as it were. And in a sense this plays against that, where you say that okay, there is a tide and they decided that rather than fight against the tide, they will actually ride the tide and they will say that we did this. But I also wonder if that is an admission of failure of their own. For example, to quote from the piece you wrote, at one point you said, you can still speak of 60 years of Congress misrule and rally your supporters, but there's a new generation that has grown up seeing you as a representation of the power structure. Further, you have to defend your own track record of a decade that has missteps, which gives the opposition reasons to show you as part of the problem rather than the solution. Stop quote. And I used to say earlier, and I used to say this many years earlier, perhaps it changed a bit, that the Congress would often behave as if there was nothing before 2014, except perhaps 2002. So they would just bash the BJP for what they did after it and maybe bring up 2002, but it's like everything that happened under them just didn't exist. And the BJP would behave as if there was nothing after 2014, and they would just keep talking about Nehru and this and that and not talk about it. And the point is, now that so much time has passed since 2014, you can't pretend there's nothing after it. You have an economic record as well, and that has consequences. And it strikes me that the only reason that we are even talking about reservations today, or that this has become an issue, is that there has been economic failure. Like in a couple of your pieces, Pranay, you quoted Pratap Bhanu Mehta's great piece on this, where he points out that the most important things required for social justice do not require caste data. Making quality education available to all, the creation of public goods, the design of welfare, the best mix of subsidies and income enhancing measures, and most importantly, an expanding economy that creates mobility do not require the framework of caste. The mistake of the social justice agenda was that it forgot Ambedkar's lesson that to effectively attack caste, you have to, for the most part, strongly but indirectly, attack the range of material deprivation that make its logic so insidious. Stop quote. These are Pratap's eloquent words. And, had the economy been booming, had the rising tide been lifting all boats, I don't think this debate would have been so powerful. So, in a sense, for the BJP to say that we are going back to the logic of caste and the logic of reservations, it also feels like it is an admission of its own failure at some level, which perhaps 2024 brings home. And therefore it is existential at two levels, that it's an indirect admission that it needs to go back to the old playbook because it's failed to deliver on the new way forward. The other is that, okay, the consolidation of the Hindu vote can wait for now. Let's go back to talking about the things that divide Hindus. And I'm just thinking aloud, taking off from what you guys are saying. So what would your sense be of this?
I mean, I'll take a small stab at it and then maybe Pranay can add. See, I see this as at a theoretical level, all of those points that you mentioned, some of which we have written as true. Yes, it is in some sense an admission that eventually, if we were we continue down the path of consolidation, and we have long years of governance, it will become 15 by 2029. It will be difficult to then justify the track record and yet be able to say that the consolidation is working in your favor, because then, like I said, the entire new generation that comes up, they will say we are not getting something, and then somebody will try and wean it away, one subgroup after the other. But one should not discount, in some sense, the political genius of the BJP in terms of still finding issues that can cohere. And I think they are taking that bet. They are saying that, listen, there is no point fighting against this. We will figure out ways in which we'll still find things to bring and consolidate. And maybe in their playbook, they have more than one such idea that they believe they can continue doing it. So that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is, if you were to take wherever there has been some amount, I mean, one of the things that you would notice at a macro level is how caste-based politics has, evolved over the years, right? So even as late as the 60s and the 70s, before the BP Mandal report that came out first in 78, 79, and then it was kept at the back burner, the leaders would come in as some kind of caste-based leaders, but they would still align themselves to largely the bigger political parties. So, you had Jagjeevan Ram, huge caste leader, Charan Singh, huge caste leader. They would be Congress leaders because it was large tent. And if they were moving, they would move to another, configuration of Janta Party, Janta Dal, whatever, still a large unit. Only in the 80s you started having, I think the first big one in my mind, at least as far as I remember, was Charan Singh moving away and creating the Indian National Lokdal at that point in time in 84. And then by the 90s, you started finding some degree of splintering, but that splintering was also still fairly macro. You would have some guy who will say that I am an OBC leader. And cut to 2014 and 19 and 24. Now you have, Kuswaha leaders, you have Musihar leaders, you have leaders that, you've got further fragmentation of these, because an ability, the more you are able to get a sense of who you are and what strengths do you have in which location, and caste census, with or without caste census, increasingly people know exact numbers of their people. I mean, that at a district and at a town and a taluka and a panchayat level, this is known. The easier your ability to aggregate and then say that I might form a much more homogeneous and unique and a distinct entity, and then I will ask for votes on that basis. So I think there is one bet that they are taking, that some of this will lead to more fragmentation, and the more fragmentation would mean that you, being still a larger unit, would have a greater magnetic force, whatever that magnetic force reasons for that, maybe power, money, whatever else. And you will still be able to attract some of them right before the election or as part of an overall understanding, and be able to win votes. So in some sense, one of the theories here is that there is an optimum level of fragmentation which might hurt consolidation, but if it goes beyond that and fragments and becomes really atomized, you might still be the beneficiary, because you are the larger pole, and the larger pole will continue to attract a hugely atomized polity, because those guys will have no other way of consolidating themselves. They will just continue to do further and further, segmentation, and then trying and winning, 2 seats, 4 seats in different places. So that's one way of thinking about how they might be thinking at this point in time.
I think agree with what RJ said, and one sort of point is people in the opposition thought that they could run with this argument and puncture the narrative of the ruling party, but we always felt that it was the ruling party can easily switch and claim victory on this point, because they have better credentials. They can say the PM is from OBC, and they can do that. Then they did this. So I think in that sense, I don't know whether BJP is as ideological, Amit, as we think it is. Maybe its ideology is to be in power. If this helps it stay in power, it is done doing that, and maybe it has figured out these kinds of calculations. So, don't know.
I think, any debate about the caste census is at its heart the debate about reservations, because that is what it comes down to. So my next question is really about that how do we look at reservations? Like, when we think about reservations as they came about after independence, a country was riven by inequalities. In fact, that was a core reason for the debates that happened about how much should we centralize power. And Gandhiji, of course, wanted more village economies, and Ambedkar's absolutely valid point that I agree with was that, look, our villages are dens of ignorance, sinks of localism, etc., etc. He just felt that all our social fractures would be exacerbated if you had more of a bottom up thing. So therefore a lot of that centralization of power happened, and the attempt to embed certain values in the constitution. And then we have reservations, and that happens 2, 3, 4 decades, and then you have the Mandal Commission, and then the expansion of it to OBCs, and then sort of the explosion of that to the extent that it's just been politicized so much that again and again you have recent agitations in India which happen, whether it's the Jats or the Marathas or the Yadavs, all asking for more reservations for themselves, and all of these, by the way, being landowning castes, and not enough people moving out of agriculture because the economy is not growing fast enough, and therefore the landownings diminish with every generation because it gets fractured, and therefore the only way out seems to be government jobs, because what the escape routes of economic growth have kind of slowed down. So how does one think about reservations today, that at one level to even have any doubt about how well they are working appears to be coming from a casteist position? But I would say it is equally valid to say that I care deeply about solving the problem of caste in India, but are reservations really working? That's a valid question to ask. Thomas Sowell had a great book on affirmative action around the world, where his case using data was that it works nowhere in the world. I'll link the book from the show notes, useful for everyone reading. But then my question is, how effective have there been? What metrics would we typically use for this? And is the question not about effectiveness, but about the political importance of reservations as a tool that you're offering to whichever naive vote bank you are talking to? Is that the whole point of it? So how does one think about this? As you said, that no party will ever be against it because you simply can't. But what is the thinking of this, nevertheless, in the political discourse, as far as nuanced differences may exist between parties? And what is really the thinking of this on the ground as well? Do we have a sense of that?
Yeah. Okay, I'll begin on this. So one thing, Amit, I think this caste census is, as you said, directly tied to reservation. People have said, oh no, let's calculate first, then we'll see what happens. But it is very clear that the implication is that one, beat that 50% limit. And second, political parties have also talked about reservation in quote unquote media and big companies as an outcome of this. So private sector reservation, etc., is also on the, at least in the Overton window, if whether it happens or not. So it is all connected to this central question of reservation. Now, if we look at, from a policy angle, if we have to look at it, we have to ask what is the outcome and what is the output which is desired from this, right? So from my sense, I think earlier outcome that was desired was that there were certain historical injustices done. No one can deny that there was caste discrimination, and what is the best way to do that in at a time when you didn't have great data, people didn't even have their whatever birth certificates, etc. So caste became a marker through which you identify that if you are belonging to a particular depressed caste, the terms that was used at that time, you must be having deprived, you would have been deprived of a number of things, education, and the historical injustices would have been done, etc. So that became a marker to signify a lot of other things, and hence reservation as a policy became quite practical at that point of time. And I think it was did make sense as the easiest way to do affirmative action under the conditions that India had at that point of time. So that was the outcome at that point of time. But cut to 2024, no one is talking about that outcome. No one is talking about correcting historical injustices. Currently, it is now an instrument to some way say for relative deprivation to correct that, or it is purely a go-to solution for any group that wants to flex its political muscles. Plain and simple, that's the way. It's a numbers game. If I have the numbers, I should have seats, and that's plainly what it is saying, right? What RSJ said, the statement which was made by the opposition party, Jitni Abadi Utna Hak. So it is just that the numbers exist, and that's why, because the numbers exist, you need to have a share in government jobs, in probably in private sector also. So there's no idea of that this will be used to correct historical wrongs, but it is just because of the number. So in that sense, from a policy angle, I think this is a violation of the Tinbergen rule, right, where you say one policy instrument, one goal, or one policy instrument should have as few goals as possible. Now it is completely flipped, and the same reservation policy is being used to do multiple things, and that's how I see it being used.
See, two, three points of divergence there from Pranay, right? Firstly, and this was one of those points on which we diverged when we, on that particular edition of our newsletter. The fact that, both of us agree that this was inevitable, you would have to do it. Now, the question was, what do you do with the data? And in Pranay's mind, that's it's a particular point, of leverage in a complex ecosystem. You start getting that data, all kinds of, things will go downhill from there. My sense is that, to come back to your original question on whether it's working and, how effective they have been, for a moment, let's try and separate these two parts. There are political parties who intend to use this as a tool of reservation, because that's the simplest way to say that we have fought for you and we have won for you something. And it's a pure, zero sum, fixed pie mindset, which in India is the easiest thing that politicians first think of, and therefore redistribute. And we've fought for you and we've got some redistribution going for you. That is one way of thinking about this, and then say that therefore this is all this is reduced to. But if you truly look at it, it's not just historical, injustice. There is injustice even today, in large parts of India. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves, what is the way to solve for it? And you can say, as Pratap Bhanu Mehta is saying, that, the right way of solving it is, good investment in infrastructure, education, making sure that, the caste data, additional data is not going to help you at all. I agree to that. But, if you get that data, and since that data is so in multiple places, there is enough in that data to suggest that there are systemic, targeted, work that you can do once you have that data in order to solve for it. You can actually at least have a look at that and ask yourself, is there something that you can get better in terms of how to draft a policy for that? Because if you only think of this as a pure political, exercise, which it is, but in the same breath, therefore, say that there is no such problem that exists today, and it is all historical injustice, I think you might be doing some disservice to a whole lot of population of people in India today who are still under the oppressive system of caste right now, right? So I'm sure Pranay will have counter to this, or clarification to this. But that's one which I think is important for all of us to acknowledge. Second, the data that at least has come out in public domain of the state-wise census that they have done. And interestingly, there is correlation. There is data of caste and, various economic performance parameters of those groups. So you have both economic and social. So you have education, you have ownership of land, ownership of tractor, two-wheelers, computer, internet, all of those things are there. If you look at that, and since you mentioned Thomas Sowell, you will find that this is exactly what has happened. there has not been any marked improvement in the lives of, if when you take the averages there, despite years of affirmative action, at least to the sections of specific subgroups in these states. So, for instance, in Bihar, the Yadav community not is not dominating the government jobs or education metrics or anything of that kind. So clearly the way reservation is worked, I mean, it's not solved any problem. And if you don't look at the data, then at least those who are trying to do this in the right way will have nothing to go by. And now you can always say everybody is a bad faith actor once they have the data. All politicians are bad faith actors, fair enough. But everybody cannot be bad faith actor, right? So the data might help. And if by chance in future we have some good faith actors across, like we had at the time when we had the economic reforms, you might get something good out of the data that you're having. By not having the data, you will never come to any kind of conclusion which actually will give you something which is fairly directed and somewhat specific in terms of solution. So those are a couple of my points on that.
Can I add to this? I think the point is not that data doesn't exist. The point is whether the state should do the counting exercise of this nature, which only makes caste more as more salient, and it gives a semi-permanency if the state counts anything, right? The person becomes their caste. That's what it will happen. So, I mean, the numbers, the data exists, right? RSJ, the fact that many surveys have been done by state level, as you already said, many individual organizations have done these surveys, they have found out. And anyways, for historical injustices, especially against SC/ST, we already have that data and the state already counts that. So all those things exist. Now it's just a point that it is being expanded to a whole larger number of people. So that's my point. Data exists. We can still find out all the things that we know. Maybe this data will be more clearer. It will probably give an aggregate number at the national level. But I don't think the costs of doing this will be a lot more than the benefits of getting incremental data on this. That's my point.
One sort of meta point that I have, and a point that was made about the British, is that the very fact that you count something and put a category to something can really deepen that and deepen the division. For example, I keep saying on the show, I keep quoting Walt Whitman and saying that, hey, we contain multitudes. But then the point is, the moment you do a caste census and you force a person to put something there, no matter what it is, then A, you are affirming that that is important to the state and it kind of matters. B, when there is political mobilization based on the caste, and when promises are being made based on what that is, it further deepens that aspect of identity instead of letting your multitudes kind of express themselves, as should be the case in any society where all individuals are a complex history of different identities and preferences, and they express each other in different ways. Part of the reason that in 2014 so much of the Dalit vote went for Mr. Modi was not necessarily because they were thinking as Dalits, but because they were thinking as Indians and saying we want to change, a better economy, etc., which may or may not have happened. And then they could vote according to, again, a cocktail of different factors. But if you boil it down to one, there is a danger that that can get ossified. What do you guys think about the notion that is indeed one thing that happened through all these years of the politicization of reservations, and B, that the caste census stands a chance of making that worse, as one aspect of the trade-off. I'm not disputing the positive aspects of the trade-off. I'll come to you later about that. RJ, I agree that data is apolitical, and I love data, the more the better. But what do you feel about this sort of aspect about it, that it plays into a zero-sum identity-based vision of the world, rather than something else?
I mean, I'll push back a little on that with a particular historical example. So I think the broad pushback, and if somebody else was sitting here, he or she might have told you that it's not that when the colonial British government started counting it, it led to some further ossification or further crystallization of this idea. I mean, this has been there and it's been very, very badly, prevalent. Everybody knew it, and that only kind of quantified it a bit. I don't think it. I mean, there is this belief that particular exercise actually made it worse, and possibly people started realizing that this kind of numbers and this kind of this deep rooted thing exists. But I think at an individual level, or at a unit level of a village, this was very well known. So I don't think they aggravated anything. But I'll come back to the example that I was talking about as to what was a positive benefit of the 1931, unintended possibly. Pranay spoke about Pune Pact. Now, why did it come about? Right? The 1931 census was also done at the same time when the provincial government and the idea of a separate electorate for the Muslims was being demanded for by the Muslim League. And that demand had to be acceded to because of, just the power of that idea, and then Jinnah and others, pushing for that really, really strongly. Now, coinciding with that came this 1931 census, where surprisingly for people, but technically that is what it is now. It doesn't sound like a surprise. They found that 52% of India is actually this depressed people, as they were called then. And remember, in 31, during that census, a lot of people were actually, giving a caste that was higher than what their original caste was, because that was what they thought. This is the opportunity for them to get out of this oppressive system. And we'll come to how things have completely inverted itself, over the last 90 years. So that 52% was actually might have been even more. And there were other challenges of how to consolidate those numbers, because in India, it's, whenever we do it, even this exercise, when we do it and we might come to the, actual logistics and mechanics of doing this, it is almost impossible to do this correctly, because you don't have a standard taxonomy for castes in India. Very, very difficult to say in one region what is one caste and what it's called, and what it is called in the other region, and so on and so forth. Anyway, we'll come to those points later. But when that number was seen, and Ambedkar, by which time had, moved out of Congress, was starting to build his own, was taking representation, was standing up as the representative of the Dalits. The demand then started that we need a separate electorate for ourselves, when that data was seen. Now, please bear in mind that the two strands from 1810s onwards of Indian political movement per se, where there was a political movement for some kind of freedom or some kind of representation for Indians, and then there was a social reform movement that was running in parallel. So the social reform movements had the likes of Raja Ram Mohan Rai and Jyotiba Phule, Mahatma Phule, the entire Bengal Pune Renaissance of a kind that used to run in parallel, Agarkars and all of these guys, right? And then you had the political movement, and the political movement largely driven by the Indian elites, the whatever, forward caste guys, who were all looking for, some kind of freedom, and, and then Tilak comes and says it's not just freedom, it's full Swaraj and all of that. These were two parallel tracks. And even after Gandhi came in, and post 1914, he was still running this like a political movement. The social movement was still being run somewhat separately, although there was much more movement of people between these two, but these were still separate. The 31 census and Ambedkar's demand made Gandhi realize that this movement has to be not just freedom movement, but also movement of emancipation of Indians. And this change is very evident in Gandhi, in his speeches. So the 32 Pune Pact, and please remember, one of the things that people don't remember, I mean, people do remember, I'm just reiterating this. Pune Pact was the first time Gandhi went on fast unto death. That was his first fast unto death threat. He had never done that before. And he did that for 5 days as these guys were negotiating. Ambedkar on one side and Madan Mohan Malviya, the most sort of right of, center guy from Congress, apart from Purushottam Das Tandon. But since Malviya was alive, he was way taller than all of these guys. And both of them, while negotiating, they knew this overhang of this sword hanging on their head of Gandhi being on a Amaran Anshan, right, on a fast unto death. And the things that Gandhi got them to agree eventually was, like Pranay mentioned, not a separate electorate, but the constituencies will be, the representative will be from that. So there were about 148 or so. And the second thing, Gandhi was asking for 5 years only. Ambedkar demanded for 10, and that 10 got again replicated once we became a republic, and that's the 10 that often people think that it was only for 10 years, but 10 years was actually only for political representation. But please note, post the Pune Pact, for about 3 years, and this also coincided with Gandhi having, in some sense, faced a bit of a humiliation as part of the second roundtable conference. He was in jail immediately after the second roundtable conference. He came out of jail, and for almost 2 or 3 years, all Gandhi did was talk about Harijan untouchability. He went on a whirlwind tour of India, and mostly going to temple towns, going to, Brihadaswara temple in Tanjore, going to Madurai, and asking why aren't Harijans allowed inside. And in many of these places, that was the first time those doors got opened. Because he realized at that time that once this genie is out, we have to take proactive steps to start addressing this. Otherwise, these two were going separately, and possibly we would have continued to go separately, except for someone like Ambedkar, who was starting to demand political, and that demand became even more legitimate after the 31 census. And this was no easy task. Again, there are people forget that there was the first attempt on Gandhi's life was in Pune in 1933 or 34, when a bomb was thrown on Gandhi as his cavalcade was going. 4 or 5 people got injured. And because the Savarna Hindus were, really, really pissed off as to what he's now, what new thing has he picked up now, and he's running around with this. So, actually, the 31 census was a trigger for this significant move of Gandhi to become even more convinced that it is not just freedom, it is also emancipation. Both these tracks should run really, really strongly through the next 15 years or so, as India progressed towards freedom. So my sense is that we don't know, what positives could come, because, as I would reiterate, that there will be good faith actors who would take this data and try to do something better with the data, apart from, the usual political shenanigans that will happen with this data. So sorry, long ramble on this.
Yeah. No, my point to that is that data exists. If someone has to make use of it, it already exists. One thing that we need to think broadly is like what Ambedkar mentions in his Grammar of Anarchy speech, that castes are anti-national, right? So finally, the goal is of annihilating caste. And and that's why, the boundary condition for that is obviously a lot of historical injustices have been done, and that's why reservation exists. And I'm okay with the way it was framed in after independence. So that obviously makes sense in that situation. But now we are talking about 2024, right? Like, what is it going to be done here? With the state giving a blessing that it should, from the union government, this is an identity that you should tell me when I'm counting you. I think that gives it a semi-permanency, which is profound. It's not just an act of mere counting. It is really, like in a complex system, a leverage which will have snowballing effects. And there is a lot of work in public policy on this. Deborah Stone's book Policy Paradox talks about how any kind of counting by the government is a political exercise. And I'll read out one or two points which I thought were interesting in that. One, for example, she says how numbers can create the illusion that the very complex and ambiguous phenomenon is simple, countable, and precisely defined. Second, numbers can create political communities out of people who share the same trait that has been counted. And numbers, by seeming so precise, help bolster authority of those who count. So the idea is that the state, by counting this, is very different from the fact that the numbers that you have otherwise. So my simple question is, if the state starts counting it and formalizes it in a way that this has been imagined, then we can pretty much discard the hope of annihilating caste even a century later. I don't think that can happen unless so that's how can an exercise that hardens a tragic aspect of our society help to eliminate it, is something that I fear about.
I want to talk about the data aspect of it, and for a moment I'm going to sort of add to what RHJ said, and then Pranay, I'm going to ask you to steelman his position about the power of data. And earlier I made the somewhat controversial assertion that the 91 reforms did more to empower Dalits than anything Ambedkar did, and Ambedkar for me is just one of the great men of the century. Nevertheless, I will say that. And the thing is, I think it must be by a factor of 100x or 200x in terms of how many Dalits it would have empowered. And my case would be that the reforms empowered more Dalit to rise out of poverty and reach prosperity than all the downstream effects even of all the educational and government institution reservations given to Dalits before that. But the point is, I have no data to prove this. I don't know if the data exists to prove this. And a larger point, which I'm sure RHJ would agree with, is that data is great because data can shed light on a lot of the contestations and arguments that are actually happening within society. That if someone is to contest, if someone is to say reservations have really worked, this is how they have worked, the question is, where is the data? If someone is to say the opposite and say reservations don't work, Sawal is right, economic growth works, the question is, where is the data? So my simple point there would be that like I said at the start of this episode, I kind of agree with both of you guys, but my simple point there is that data is usually important, because otherwise what happens is that we are all telling stories by joining dots, but there are so few dots out there that we can draw anything we want and it will seem plausible, and then it becomes a question of one point of view versus another point of view. Whereas the more data that you have, and you're right that other data exists, there are other proxies for figuring this stuff out, but this would be another data set that is kind of coming up, happening on a regularized basis through a process that is hopefully transparent and accountable in some way. So for me, this is the biggest kind of part of it, a point that RHJ makes in his piece, that data is apolitical. You can use it for many things, and one of the things you can use it for is not necessarily to propose one policy or another policy, but to just shed light on ho kya raha hai, where does society stand today. So I've tried to give a bit of a sense of what I feel about the importance of data. And Pranay, would you like to respond? And would you first like to steelman his and my position on the importance of data, and then you can respond?
Yeah. I mean, obviously data is important, right? Like I can't make the argument that for any policy analyst it is important. And in fact, a lot of people who are supporting this move are also data analysts and political observers, and their point is right, that in the sense the government has become more restrictive in terms of giving out data, so it makes sense to demand more data from the government, and hence if they give this kind of data, it will probably help and make sense of a lot of the things, right? That's probably the assumption. Given that there's very few data available, maybe this will help in that sense, is the general argument. So that's how I would steelman it. But now let me question
Wait. RHJ, is the steelmanning correct? Do you agree with it?
Yeah, broadly right. I think I agree with it.
Okay, so now let me ask that same question. Now, as we said, the data is being counted just not for OBC, but on SC/ST, every census has been counting it, right? So you already have that data. There are many papers which have been written on whether reservations are helping, but as you know, many of these studies will be done in one particular segment. There'll be arguments on both sides, so you will have a very broad set of answers. So given that data already exists, the fact that you are still asking this question, that did reservation work or not, proves my point that that data is, you will have more data, but it will not give you a absolute answer that you are looking for.
So I'll bring up another question, which is about what are we trying to fight exactly, and what are we correcting for? Like, there are these beautiful lines by you, Pranay, in your 2021 piece, where you write, and so it appears that reservations have ceased to be a means to correct for inadequate representation of certain disadvantaged sections. Instead, reservations have become springboards for all groups to demand proportional representation. The implicit norm now is that the state needs to enable representation of groups in educational institutions and government jobs according to their proportion in the population. The question of historical disadvantage has been relegated to an incidental criterion. And this seems to me to be a superbly important shift. That at one point you could say that, look, the constitution says we should treat everyone equally. Why is taking caste into consideration ever a basis for treating anyone differently, as reservations do? But the argument against that was, look, historical inequalities, and just look at what the Dalits have gone through, and this is necessary to have that kind of emancipation which our great leaders spoke of. And interestingly, Ambedkar and Savarkar were on the same side of the debate against Gandhi, and here I would say that I'd agree with both of them and not Gandhi on this particular matter. But then the question here is that, okay, that's the intention it started with, and fine, those inequalities are deep, accepted, let's go on. But if that shift has happened today, where, as is clearly the case, that you are really talking about proportional representation and not correcting for something, for historical grievances, and it's a separate debate whether historical grievances can be corrected for in that matter, but assume that they can. But if it has now become a question of proportional, ki, jitni abadi utna haq, etc., as the slogans go, then isn't that a means through which these group identities will forever be perpetuated, and caste can simply not be annihilated, because it will now become the basis of the redistribution of opportunities and perhaps even wealth later within society. And in fact, as far as redistribution of wealth according to caste is concerned, Rahul Gandhi has even spoken of that in speeches. So, RHJ, what would be your sort of counter to this aspect of it? Because as you can see, I agree entirely with you on the importance of data, but there is a social impact to the collection of the data and what it will inevitably be used for. Like, all of us know the inevitable outcome. Right now, OBCs are restricted to 27% of reservations. These numbers are going to find that they are more than 50%, and then there will be a massive political movement for demand that then give us more than 50%, and this becomes a terribly slippery slope. The Bihar, sort of the informal caste census kind of thing they did last year, found that OBCs, EBCs together were 63%. So given that, what do we do? That would there then be a danger that we are working against the annihilation of caste and not for it?
So, just to quickly dispatch off this first point on going down the slippery slope of this proportional representation everywhere. Of course, that is just completely a stupid idea, and it's impossible to achieve. I mean, this is that old argument of you trying to create a patterned society. I mean, you cannot ever create a patterned society because every single new transaction will disturb the pattern, and then it's very soon you will be down to Soviet Union commissars and everyone trying to make sure that the pattern remains constant. And even in this data, like, which was there, and when I was looking at the data, I'm like, in if you try and balance the land holding, then you will find that some two-wheeler holding is going to be different. It's already different. So it's not that it's always in the same pattern of the way the population is. So this is, I mean, anybody going down this path will soon realize that this is a path to nowhere. And in some ways, there might be an election or two where some of these things will be salient. Soon people will realize that, and I'm hoping that that futility and stupidity is understood by doing this and then showing to people that this is waste of time. Insofar as trying to use this as reservation, proportional representation, and all of that basis, because people will very soon see impossible to do it. And any one thing that they try and do, they'll find something else is lacking, and then it's like trying to catch your own tail. The thing that I'm interested in, and again, not anecdotally, but broadly speaking, are things like, so for instance, on various metrics, a few states have done well uh, when it comes to the output of the reservation scheme that they have run, right? Now, it's also true that some of those states have been possibly better governed, and they have also done well economically, and therefore there is that element involved in that. But I mean, the classic example of this is Tamil Nadu, and to some extent Karnataka and Telangana, Andhra Pradesh also. These were some of the first states which went up to 50%. In fact, Tamil Nadu first tried 69. That was the first use case. And if you notice, I mean, there was all of these fears that, all kinds of people will become engineers, all kinds of, they will then build bridges, and, since merit will not be taken into consideration, things will fall apart, and so on and so forth. Just looking at, outside in the economic parameters and social parameters in Tamil Nadu, it seems to have worked really, really well. Now, the thing about asking for data is to check what worked. And to Pranay's point on, you already have the SC/ST data. Listen, there is a problem there. I mean, and I don't have full data to prove that, but feels like that often. That's 22.5% reservation, many of which those seats were never filled up. And in many cases, those folks, it was not filled up because a whole lot of other issues on the ground meant that a lot of them never came up to that position to do that. So that's, it's in my sense somewhat of a sparse data, not even fully available for us to draw many conclusions from. That's my, not a very scientifically backed view, but I think there is some merit to that. But if you have a full Tamil Nadu data, where we had this 27% of OBC getting in, and see it, maybe there are some lessons to be learned. And maybe we have to think about that. Same with Karnataka, same with other things. And it is so apparent. I mean, this is just the anecdotal part of it. I began my working career with a 11-month stint in Tamil Nadu, in Chennai. I had never been to Chennai before that. And, I liked my, meat and fish and everything. And that first 2-3 months were an absolute shock in Chennai, because in the places that I would stay and frequent and things of that kind, there was just hardly any restaurant that served non-vegetarian food. There's 97. I used to go to Velu Military Kitchen out in near Adiyar Signal to eat non-veg food. But there was hardly anything. I go now, over the last 7-8 years, every alternate shop is a biryani shop in Chennai. So that, which only goes to prove that, I mean, whatever has happened in the last 25 years, when many others might disagree with me whether that has been good for Tamil Nadu or not, but broadly speaking, a lot of that change socially, culturally, everything has happened because of maybe coming together of good governance. I mean, it's been very corrupt, but it's effectively corrupt, as they might say. And, good representation and the ability to do both of it together and raise the standards of the state. So I'm in no way saying that, proportional representation is in any way a good idea. I mean, it's the most terrible idea. But getting data for Tamil Nadu kind of an experiment, and there could be many more examples of this, maybe at more granular level, could be of tremendous use.
Yeah. But that data exists. So, in the sense that Karnataka also did it doesn't call it the census, but it did a survey, right? So that survey exists.
Yeah. So sorry, Pranay, just my point remains the same. If you do it systematically every 10 years, done by the central government for everyone, some amount of aggregation is done. I mean, how is that? I mean, I fail to see how is that going to strengthen the already strong endogamous caste thing that we have. The only way the caste affiliations have gotten weaker is through economic growth and urbanization. Those are the only two things that I have seen that have actually helped. I have often said this. My son knows. He's upper, maybe that's why. But he really doesn't know the guy who's sitting next to him, what is his caste, because he's never asked that question, nor is that guy asking. And I think that is true in most large urban agglomerations. And therefore, we should continue working on that. None of these are going to solve, whether you count them or don't count them, is not going to either strengthen or weaken that particular identity. The only way it weakens is possibly, the old Ambedkar formulation of study in English, get educated, and go to urban locations and get out of villages.
Yeah. No, I think that's where we disagree on this point, that once the state counts, it has a very different implication, whereas I think RSJ believes it doesn't impact significantly.
Elaborate on that. Once a state counts, why does it have a very different
Because
implication?
every, like I discussed, every counting by the state is a political exercise. It creates numbers, create that sense, that when you measure something, this factor is more important than other factors, right? Any counting exercise is an exercise about categorizing. And when you categorize, you are trying to say this factor is more important. You have to include some people in this category and not in another category, right? I mean, if you can see today, probably the biggest reason of not being able to improve might just be you not being a part of a network, right? You are in a rural area. Maybe your parents not knowing English is the biggest barrier to you becoming something, right? So when you are counting not many of those factors, but you're counting one particular factor, which is caste, then that gains a much more significant factor than others. And I'm not, this is not a defense of not having data, right? I'm saying that data exists, people can count, there is the state governments are already counting. But when you do that from the union government, that has a very long-term effect that we should be aware of, is my point.
So, Pranay, just help me. We are counting data of income. We are counting data about education. How are those counts not political and creating a whole lot of, identity chaos and, things of that kind? And just an addition of caste will, create that kind of thing.
Yeah, because castes are anti-national, whereas having different incomes is not anti-national.
Religion?
Yeah, religion is obviously known to people anyways. So it can't be hidden.
Are you saying that there is a shaping involved in the act of asking caste, whereas there is obviously religion is known, income is known, there's no shaping there, those are just colder facts, whereas asking a caste has implications and effects. Is that what you're saying?
Do you want religion to go away? Is religion anti-national? No, it is not. I mean, you can have different religions. It's okay for people to say I'm a but that's the whole point, right? If you want a particular phenomenon to go away, if that is your whole objective, then how is it that giving it so much importance that it should be counted every time, and you have to give that point? How is that going to reduce its salience?
So a further question, but before that, a very quick question for RLJ. What's the difference between conglomeration and agglomeration?
I think conglomeration is a planned thing, right? I mean, you have corporates that are conglomerates. There is much more central kind of a thing with a planned idea, with some common ways of doing things. Agglomeration happens because there is some pole and that attracts people, but it's not necessarily the pole's job to attract people under some guidelines. It just happens. I think that's my...
Very nice. No, I'll check if it's true, but if it's true, then I'm totally for agglomerations and against conglomerations, because we are all in the bottom-up way of doing things. Here's a question for both of you. Like, let's think a little ahead. Let's go beyond the first-order effects of and why they are doing it, and the inevitable demand that's going to come for a certain kind of reservation happening here. Let's think about the unintended consequences of that, the downstream effects, the second and third order effects of this. And I'd like you both to speculate on that, both good and bad. So, who wants to start?
Let me begin. So, I think one second order effect is consolidation around caste will also lead to another round of consolidation around religion. So again, the cycle which we saw in late 80s and 90s, probably, right? That is what I can speculate. The other one, yeah, like I said, this is done for a political purpose. So you will have many downstream things. I can see, just like today we talk about one nation, one market, because we have supposedly one tax system. But we will not be one market, because we will be many markets for labor, because then this idea of filling seats in private institutions according to your background, your caste, will gain salience. So that, I think, it really divides the Indian labor market in ways we can't foresee. And yeah, RSJ mentioned probably this will be done and people will realize and go back. I mean, it's too big a cost to do, in my opinion. That was the second one. The other sort of long term, yeah, what could be the positive impact? Yeah, positive impact could be that just because there is also an exercise in subcategorization, as RSJ was saying, maybe if there is economic growth on the other side, then this factor will become less salient over time. But that is probably one hope. See, an example I can think of is engineering seats. See, the whole issue is coming because there is scarcity of certain things, and when scarcity is there, you have this idea of, how do you distribute something scarce, and then reservations or quotas become one way. But if you look at, say, engineering seats and compare that with medical seats, for example, engineering seats, there's no as such shortage, in at least in many states in southern India. So this idea of you getting into it because of scarcity, and hence you need some form of quota to get into it, becomes less relevant. So if that kind of abundance exists in many other areas, then probably you will not have this as more important. But that's tough to imagine that happening suddenly. The third point I want to say is, I think what I can foresee is that underrepresented, once this number is counted, underrepresented subcastes will seek quotas within quotas. Then overrepresented will find a way to fudge their caste and then their income certificates to position themselves favorably. Then new subcastes will be conjured up. Demand for new quotas will rise. These are some things we can foresee, right? The fact that the government already has this economically weaker sections quota just proves that point, that this will just be, you keep dividing the pie more and more, you keep expanding this to others. That is something will be probably the second order effect.
Arilche, what about you? I mean, one of the particularly enlightening parts of your piece had been about the many different questions that you can ask with the data. I think you'd given 4 examples. I'm sure there are many more. Would you like to speak a bit more about that? Like, then from the point of view of someone who is trying to gain legibility into society, that what is happening? What are the current problems? How are they getting solved? How is X policy helping? How is Y policy hurting? Data can shed light on that. So would you like to talk about like those 4 examples and what else comes to mind and what other downstream effects can be?
Just one point before I go. See, the thing around affirmative action is, or any of this kind of quota reservation, does stem from scarcity, but it is not that when things are not scarce, this will not be there. I mean, the reason why there is demand for affirmative action in the US, or it started, was not because US there was at India level scarcity, but it's a question of what is the relative position of a particular group with respect to another group, and whether they feel that the relative position is in sync with the capabilities of that particular group, or have they started off at a very different starting point, and therefore this delta exists. Right. So I don't think we think that a large part of this is because we are not able to create enough jobs and enough, not increase the pie. To some extent, that is right. I mean, that is true. And which is why I wanted to bring that Tamil Nadu example. But if you grow the pie also, and if the relative positions continues to remain as wide as they were in the past, this demand will always be there. It's not that the blacks, and this is where I have some difference of opinion with Saval. He says that in the last 70 years, the blacks have had the best time. I mean, in terms of how much they have come, how far they have come in terms of things that have improved. And therefore, what's the point of this affirmative action? But the demand for affirmative action does not come because you have done well only. It also comes because what is the relative gap between you and the others, and that continues to animate and demand, demand, better representation and things of that kind. So that's a point. I mean, I just want to make sure that people appreciate that.
I mean, I would just say, just to push back a little, that the demand for affirmative action in the US is nowhere near as central as it is in India. So the level of scarcity definitely plays a part. It is, of course, there because people will always protest social inequalities. It is not as high there as, in India, it is absolutely central.
Amit, we had an entire decade in the US with deaths, riots. Actually, India has not had that kind of a thing. The whole of 1960s was way more in terms of political activism, people going behind bars, fighting for this. I don't think India has had that level of ferment, largely because there are other theories around why we possibly accept our station in life.
The ferment was great, but how much of it was about affirmative action per se? The ferment was about the social inequalities and the different ways of, say, MLK or Malcolm X to deal with that, but it wasn't so much about that one issue.
No, I agree. I'm not, but it's not. I mean, affirmative action is a broader. I mean, is a smaller. I mean, subset of the point that we are not getting the right representation in everything, right? And whether it's how we are treated in restaurants and buses and also public spaces, everything. So while the lot of blacks in terms of economic pure economic measures in 60s was way better than say 1900, so they should have been happier that we are better than our ancestors, but it was a different problem. And I think a lot of Indian literature, and if you were to sit on a panel of people where Dalit leaders and Dalit scholars are talking about issues, they will come back to this point on respect, on all of these things, which we don't have lived experience. Often we don't speak about it, and for them, we might not be able to articulate the link between this activity of caste census to what it means for their self-respect. So that's one. On the points in terms of the upside or the possible benefits, I mean, I think there is going to be some good coming out of the very fact that whether it is whatever has happened so far, has it worked? Not just the 22% of SC, but this additional 27%. And why has it worked in some places and why hasn't it worked in some places? Or is it a complete disaster? In which case, then, you can have a good amount of debate to see how to make that, how to make some of these reservation things effective. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. The second is this old question of how long should we be doing this? Again, I don't think there is any good debate around what is a good length of time for which you should have some of this. But clearly, we've had it for at least 20 years in case of OBCs and 70 plus years in case of SC/ST. Clearly, the OBC data is much wider and possibly has more number of states and everything represented. We should ask ourselves that question as well. What is the ideal duration for continuing something like this? Then there is also the question of who should be excluded. If there is always this question of there is a creamy layer and things of that kind. So what is the relative movement that has happened, at least economically, on these matters? And if there is a reason for us to say that some people have cornered a lot more than they should, largely because of state intervention. And maybe the state should not intervene, but maybe the state should create a playing field which makes that, either go away or brings the other faster, at the same level. So there are ways of looking at this which can help with some of these questions today, which we do not necessarily have proper answers to. Pranay might say that individual surveys exist in different places, but I have a feeling a national survey every 10 years, if you do it twice, you'll get something way better in terms of good aggregate data. I do have reservations about, not reservations, wrong term to use, but I do have my own apprehensions about how this will be done. I mean, the pure, logistics, the taxonomy and things of that kind, but that's a different discussion altogether.
Amit, I wanted to add one big point that of the second order effect that I think Pratap also made in that article. I think the fact that the opportunity cost of all this is all focus is on caste and counting caste and doing this, which sort of then defeats the point of the other things that the state has to do in order to actually improve things, right? So see, just look at it, right? A lot of this, the OBC political representation things came from the northern states, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and there were strong parties which came out of that as well. But the record of those parties on the things which will actually improve the situation of a whole lot of people is pretty poor. In fact, when Pratap wrote this article, there were other people who responded also saying that, that is not right. Just see the number of people in Bihar who are appearing for government UPSC exams and others. That proves that it is not the case. I mean, that exactly proves his point that people don't have any other opportunity. So they are trying to look things in the government jobs. They have no other option. So in that sense, I think the opportunity cost point is very significant for me, because we'll just declare victory that, now we have given reservation for everyone. There is 2% according to your caste or whatever, and that's it. Like that, the state has done its job. Whereas what the state should have done, having financing education or having better higher educational institutes, that is just not on the table at all. And that to me is what scares me. And the second, one more thing that sort of is downstream effect is just the fact that a group identity becomes more important than your individual agency is sort of something which worries me. I know it already exists. There is, but do you want to even emphasize it even more is something that concerns.
In India, the classic thing applies, right? There is always an example on the other side as well. Where did the first set of real, genuine social reforms start of the militant kind? It's not North India. It's actually Tamil Nadu and Kerala, right? And there, the political the political formulations that evolved from there, whether it was Periyar and the entire Nambudiris giving away their land and the communist movement in Kerala, actually worked out somewhat better than North India, because you didn't have all of this problems of, you had regional parties, you had parties based on very strong regional caste, other identities. But broadly they did fine. So you don't know whether the reason for that was the North Indian parties going on the basis of caste and just using that and not actually doing anything serious. When some other parties have done that in some other states, it's actually worked out fairly well.
So I want to sort of double click on Pranay's point about opportunity cost and take that further and come to my next question, which is that I also worry that what happens here is that there is a crowding out effect in the world of ideas in one's head, that we are almost deifying one particular framework of thinking. Like if you say that, okay, we're going to have a caste census, and then that inevitably leads to political calls for proportional distribution of opportunities when it comes to education or government jobs and so on and so forth. What it does is that it means that you are thinking that you're internalizing at least two frameworks that I find deeply dangerous. One is a zero-sum mindset, that there is, a fixed basket of opportunities and perhaps even wealth, and we need to redistribute that for social justice. And the other is an identity-based way of thinking, which essentializes, which takes away one's agency, and it essentializes to whatever your identity of birth is, which is something that in any good society we should all transcend. And as you pointed out, RLJ, that's exactly what happens in the case of, that's exactly what economic growth and urbanization do to us. They allow us in different ways to play in a positive sum game, not a zero sum game, and, transcend those identities. And I worry about this. I worry that, first of all, I think it is an admission of failure by the current government to say that, okay, we're going to go back to caste and we're going to try to play around those margins and we're going to try and do it better than the other guys because we are smarter than them. But that's essentially the game that we are playing. And the moment you define it like that, I worry that these frameworks come into play where you think of society as a zero-sum thing and then everything is a fight over who gets what percentage of that pie. And that then deviates the citizen's mind from asking for accountability from the state which is supposed to serve us. Because then I no longer ask, where are the good roads, where is the infrastructure, where is the economic growth, where are the 40 million jobs that would have existed had you run the economy properly, because I don't even know they're not there. And instead the mind goes to, okay, this is my identity of birth, and am I getting enough reservations, and etc., etc. And I just think that that's just in the space of ideas and what is conceptually possible and how we think of our citizenship and the relationship between us and the state. I think it's very dangerous. What would you guys have to say about that?
I think I'm on that same thought process, Amit, and I think not just the relationship between individuals and the state, but the relations between each other is also an important factor, right? Then, because that essentializes your identity. I mean, that's why Ambedkar says castes are anti-national, right? If you want to be an Indian nation, then you can't have castes. So that's the whole point. Of course, I mean, how to achieve that, etc., is a different question, but I agree with you on that.
See, the only question here is the point that if we agree to the point that by the act of including this in a census and counting it makes it stronger, then it follows that then you will have way more energy and whatever limited policy thinking, etc., that we have will get devoted to this, and it will crowd out good ideas. I'm not very sure whether that is necessarily going to be the case, but if you agree, if you take that point as given, then it will definitely crowd it out. My sense is that any day you open an India newspaper, you open the matrimony page, I mean, where are we going away from caste in any case? So I mean, this point on people getting distracted and therefore not demanding the more fundamental macro things because all of this takes a lot of your time away. I would say that problem is a problem in general to solve for. Whether this actually makes it worse, I mean, I am not yet convinced that it makes it worse. So I'll have to maybe sit down with Pranay over a beer sometime in person and try and get some deeper understanding of why will it make it worse just because the state is counting. He's given that. I understand what he's told, but I still need to be convinced.
Yeah, I know. I think like one point on that is Devesh Kapoor had a very nice paper, right? Why does the Indian state both fail and succeed? And one of the points in that paper is also about how the demand for public goods in India is much lower than community goods or private goods, right? So, and that is again a situation which arose because of a multiple reasons. But once you have this going ahead, I think that will accentuate. So again, why do you want public goods to be provided? If I can get something for myself, it's done, right? And if I can get something as a quota, it's done. By the way, my whole point is not against affirmative action, right? I think affirmative action is definitely required. There's all the things we know from India, it is required. I'm just debating whether quotas and reservations are the way to do affirmative action. And we had written a few other ideas on that, but that's my only limited point.
Yeah, my point is also not against them actually. I don't think they make much of a difference this way or that way, and I don't think it's a big deal if they remain. And I'll be a Dalbadlu and now quickly shift over to backing up RHJ's point and say that, yeah, I mean, it's like one quote I remember which has a lot of truth in it is Andrew Breitbart's quote that politics is downstream of culture. So rather than say that, hey, the state is doing this and that will change society, I think we often underestimate and do an injustice to society when we say that society is already is resilient. Everything happens bottom up. It's messed up in a bunch of ways. If you think of the political class as a reflection of supply responding to demand, then it changes completely. So a complete sort of question you might not have expected. What's happening with Indian society? Because on the one hand, you would expect that the world has globalized over the last 30, 40 years and there's been much more prosperity, though as we discussed since 2011, a lot of it has stalled and things haven't really gone in the right direction. But what do you think of when you think of a society? Like one of the thought-provoking points that made me reconsider a lot of things during all these years of the Seen and the Unseen was when Veer Sanghvi made the argument that, that look, 1991 was great, or was it Vinay Sitapati who made this argument that look, 1991 was great because it got hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but at the same time the empowered middle class that rose began to assert itself politically, and it was large, and that was one of the factors that led to the growth of Hindutva, because it was deeply, to use a euphemistic term, kind of conservative in that way. And so it is not necessary that economic growth and opening up to the world necessarily makes you more liberal or more progressive in the ways that we would like. So what is kind of your sense of that? Because RHJ, you started at first by talking about, not your words, but I'm paraphrasing, that the BJP had no option but to respond to this tide of public opinion, and it chose to ride it rather than have to give in to it later. So what is really happening with the people? What is your sense of this? That what are the directions we are moving in?
Yeah, I'll just begin by this. Actually, it's true for the US also, right? Like, let's look at what is happening in the US. So I think there are some global currents which are in play. I mean, internet also has to do, social media also has to do something with it. So there are some global forces. Conservatism and populism is being there in many other places. So it's not just an India specific thing. On India specific thing, I think there is my perception is that there is still limited mobility. The kind of mobility we should have been able to do, we have not been able to do, and that has had a lot of downstream consequences, right? So that I think is the central point which generates a lot of other things. The idea that also you have, if there are no opportunities in India, you would want to go outside, where there are no, that mobility point impacts in many ways, and it also probably has an impact on this particular situation. I would begin there. I don't know, RSJ, what do you think?
See, this question of Indian society, I will sort of lean on possibly a person who I consider to be among the finest, most astute observer of any society, wherever he went, even for a week. And then he would write a book about that, which is V.S. Naipaul. And, back when he wrote An Area of Darkness, it's quite stunning that within the first, maybe I'm misremembering, but I think it was fairly early in the book. He gets off as he's coming out from the airport and heading towards his hotel in South Mumbai. He sees a huge queue standing of all kinds of people looking fairly destitute, not local to Bombay, of course. And they're all standing in a queue, very orderly. And being the man that he was, some, good observer of people. I know there are lots of negative stories about Naipaul, but I'm of the kind. I like Woody Allen, I like Naipaul. You can keep you can keep their personal foibles aside. He gets off and he asks, "Ho kya raha hai?" And then he realizes that this is Ambedkar Jayanti, and this is people are there is that Ambedkar memorial there in Bombay, and even now on December 6th. By the way, it is December 6th. I mean, the way currents in India work. Uh, uh, everybody comes and they stand in the queue. So this thing intrigues Naipaul, and he's like, "Oh wow, this is something interesting." And while he had come on a bit of a personal trip, eventually he goes to UP, to the same village where his original parents came from, and they offer him food. He is not very keen on eating their cooked food. Then they go take him to a nearby khet and they give him some peas, and he eats those peas and so on and so forth. But coming back, so he notices this, and then guess who does he spend a fair amount of time in Bombay during that trip? He spends time with Bal Thackeray, a young Bal Thackeray in the 60s, when Thackeray had not really become anything as he later became. So he recognized this, this trend also. And then he also speaks of poverty, because that book is called An Area of Darkness. He's so appalled by India's poverty and the political decisions that the government was taking at that point in time, which he felt was completely wrong for India. Now, the reason why I'm telling all these three things, he noticed Ambedkar queue, he met Thackeray, and he was appalled by India's poverty. I grew up, there were three key events, and surprisingly, and for all of us, they happened in 3 successive years. And they might have been more salient to me and Amit because we are a bit older than Pranay. Maybe he might have felt not as intimately as we possibly felt it. In 1990, Rajiv Goswami tried to immolate himself. It's a day, I mean, all of us who were there as kids, we never forgot. I was 14 and I remember that day. And I remember that evening news bulletin and, all the maramari that was happening, all the kids outside protesting and things of that kind. And there is this boy from Deshbandhu College who has burnt himself, right? And that image in the next week's India Today and everything. I mean, the first time I realized that this thing about caste is real in India. Till then, it was just some concept. And that began my lifelong fascination with caste. In 91, we had Manmohan Singh stand up and give the 91 budget, dismantling everything. And in 92, we had Babri Masjid. Those three have been seminal events of my life. And it's no surprise that 35 years since then, these are equally relevant today. We are eventually talking the same thing. We are talking, see, even while starting off with a caste discussion, we said there is something will happen because of this around religious consolidation. So we'll be back to Kamandal. And we did talk about, economic reform and the pie growing and things of that kind. So, and maybe almost 25 years before that, Naipaul came and he noticed the same three things. He noticed people standing for Ambedkar, he noticed Bal Thackeray doing something, and he noticed that our economic policies were all downright crap. So I think my general view about Indian society, therefore, to come to some kind of a point that I'm trying to make here is, ये तीन हमारे सोसाइटी में जाने नहीं वाला है. The balance, relative balance, and how it is getting played out. We will have decades, and we'll be lucky if we have decades of economic growth taking precedence over the other two. We did have about 15, 20 years of that. Good for us. But, this is like some kind of a cycle. We will continue to be in this kind of cycle for some time. Now, some amount of political genius, some amount of pragmatism can make it can actually bring economic growth regardless of what you do on the other two factors. A large part of 90s we were able to navigate that, and that was great for us, and some part of 2000s also, fair amount of 2000s also. So my general hope is that in the Indian society glacially will continue to move towards something that is looking better than what it was yesterday. Clearly, our society today, in broad sense, is better than what it was in the 90s, notwithstanding keyboard warriors and all these guys who come on Twitter and do crap. But it is glacial. There will be all these moments of one step forward, two steps back, and so on and so forth. But these three strands will continue to be the dominant ones. I always hope, and that's what both Pranay and I hope in our newsletter, is that despite some of these, we need to continue to keep the singular objective of getting as many people in India prosperous as our sole aim of our policy making, and everything else is secondary to that. So that's really some, broad brushed broad brush view of the Indian society. I think everything else, like Naipaul wrote in his third book, in India there are a million mutinies now all the time. I mean, that's always happening. It's very difficult to arrive at a single story that takes, that gives sense to the particular moment that we are in. But these three strands will always be the three strands that will go up and down in political and social life of India.
What's your view, Amit?
No. I mean, a million mutinies now is actually 1.4 billion mutinies now, and I'm going to be a little mischievous here, and I'm going to suggest that the point you made, Pranay, about a lot of this ferment being a response to opportunities drying up, to not being better jobs out there. It makes me think of another trifecta, not the one RHA mentioned, but another trifecta of things that seem to have a circular relationship, and I'm being mischievous here. Just as I earlier said, politics is downstream of culture. In certain ways, it could be said that culture is downstream of economics. And of course, economic policy is made by the state, so economics is downstream of politics. And therefore, you have the circle of snakes eating, or three snakes eating each other's tail, as it were, and God knows where it ends up. But my sense of it is that, it's largely, I think, I agree with what RHJ said and what I know you would say, that the way out is simply economic growth. We take it for granted when it happens, and most people don't realize the extent to which that is the answer to all questions, including in the long run, to the terrible problem of caste. And I totally agree with Pranay that it's just deeply anti-national. I remember, the great Dalit scholar Chandrabhan Prasad was on my show, and he said his heroes were Ambedkar and Adam Smith, and both awesome heroes to have, and both really relevant heroes to have. So that is my sort of short view, that the future is unknown unknowns, and therefore I am never completely hopeless. And also, there is that phrase, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I think that kind of describes me well. I'll link to everything both of you guys have written on it, even though this is going to be an extremely short episode of The Seen and the Unseen if we wrap it up soon. I'll do that, but I'll ask for closing remarks from both of you before I go to recommendations at the end, which I won't let you get away from. But closing remarks before that, and what do you think are the best case and worst case outcomes for that? I know I asked you a version of that, Pranay, about unintended consequences. RHJ completely dodged that question, but he can't dodge it now. So give me a sense of the best case and the worst case. What do you think of Indian politics today? Where is it? What makes you, what gives you hope? What gives you despair?
I'm mostly optimistic in life, so although sometimes what I write doesn't seem like that. My general view is that the broader forces of I mean, we might have a receding of globalization in terms of trade, but there is not going to be any receding of globalization in terms of culture and service and things of that kind. And that's a very important, powerful force. And unless we really shut our borders and do a China-like thing on some of these platforms and things of that kind, I think that's a positive force for continuing to have people question, learn, and in general broaden their worldview. And in general, therefore, there will be progress on many of these things that in the past was slow because people just didn't know better. The negatives of some of those things are there, all the WhatsApp forwards and everything. I agree with that. But I think broadly the positives will outweigh the negatives. And as I have seen generationally in the last 30-40 years. So that's one positive way. And then automatically the political parties will respond. Firstly, because a lot of them will come out of this lot eventually. And secondly, they will respond to what the demand side of the equation is. Second, I think, this is again being very hopeful and optimistic. I think that there is going to be some degree of running out of trying all of these, emotional / identity, issues. Either some part of that we would have run the course, or in some cases it would be so settled a matter whether you like it or not that there is not much that you can extract out of it. So for instance, Hindutva as an ideology, I think post Ram temple and everything, after some time you will lose. Sometimes I feel that there is nothing much more to mobilize yourself, although people do try their best to do it. You will run out of runway for some of these ideas or some of these topics. I have a feeling, and which is my maybe there is a 5-10 year ferment, but I have a feeling even this caste thing, once you get this thing out, it might mean some terrible times. And Pranay is right that is not worth the cost of everything else. But if I take a slightly longer, hopeful view of it, again, people will realize it amounted to nothing, and we were better in the way we were going. This was just a complete distraction. So I'm hoping that some of these things that seem to be so deeply embedded in our polity, once we fan them and give them full air, either they resolve themselves one way or the other. We might not like it, but it gets resolved, or people run out of patience with them. In which case, then maybe we'll come back to more core issues, and hopefully that will be better for us. The third thing I believe is we have not spoken about. All of us are talking things which are like have been in India for thousands of years, but technology is going to play a very important role. And while in the past there was some demarcation because a lot of technology was used by institutions in service of the end user and consumer. But this direct to consumer technology in terms of its democratization, whether it is direct to consumer products or it is this whole business of giving large computing power and making it democratic in terms of access for people. I really don't know. I mean, somebody needs to do some work around that in terms of what kind of impact that will have on many of these issues that have historically been core political issues for us. Because clearly there is an economic impact which might make it worse in terms of jobs and employment for us, which might then lead to more demands for some kind of universal income and things of that kind. But even otherwise, what kind of jobs, what kind of things that will matter. Maybe we'll have a full circle life going full circle where people who can work with their hands will actually have some advantage over people who are just, doing the white collar traditional services jobs. So I think that's a third thing that to me again it will be a force of good, but again that it will play out in various ways, and it might become a political issue 5 to 7 years from now as more and more of that comes in, and people will have to start finding some solution for some answers to that. So those are my positive takes. Negative take is, you know, this battle of consolidation of Hindu votes versus this centrifugal force that people are trying to use in order to break BJP's political hegemony. I think that could bring us to some of the worst instincts of Indian society, which we have seen in the past. And that would mean, 5 to 10 years of just complete waste of, of time in terms of using and doing the good things. Instead, we'll be just, in some sense, going over the same old questions and losing time.
Amit, I wanted to end this by actually talking about an idea for affirmative action, which is different. So, Nitin and I had written this a couple of years ago on trying to reimagine how can we think about it. And the idea comes from golf. Just like golf has different handicap scores in order to have an even game, there is something which can be imported for them in today's times, right? Remember, quotas as a policy was done at a time when you really didn't know anything about the person, and a lot of things were coterminous with caste. But today things might be different. So one idea that we had was actually to have a situation where there are no predetermined quotas for any post, but positions are filled on the basis of a composite scores. And the composite score has two components. One is the inequity score, and that inequity score can account for multi-dimensional problems, right? Parents' level of education, income levels, rural upbringing, childhood nutritional deficiencies, which also has a very long-term impact, right? Those things are not even being thought today, right? So you need to have those kinds of factors for the inequity score. And the second measure is purely measuring effectiveness for the particular post or job or study position which is being considered for, right? So that is just measuring how good you are in doing that job which I require. And no seats are reserved. There is a combination of these two factors, and the person who's evaluators who are looking at the efficiency scores have no idea about the inequity score, so that is kept aside. And then finally you have a combination which tries to positions are filled based on the sum total of these two, right? There's no fixed position. That way you are taking into account the fact that you're judging a person on the merit of them being able to do that task, and you're also taking into account the huge amount of impact that your past has on your ability to go into the future. And we try to design it in a way that there can be a national commission for equity which can be formed to propose the review parameters, the weightages for each of these factors. They doesn't need to even be a one size fits all solution. States can assign their own factors, and weightages can be according to local conditions. So this I think I don't think it is a perfect solution, but I think we need more ideas on how affirmative action can be done in today's time and age. Otherwise, current situation is we have one solution in mind and we are copy pasting it for solving everything, and that I think is a thing I want to leave people with.
I'll link to that the essay that you and Nitin wrote on this. I think it was for Free Post,
First
right?
Post, yeah.
First Post, yeah. I'll link on that. I mean, I find it fascinating and thought-provoking and worth discussing. Though my instinctive thought when I first read it was that it's a fantastic engineering solution to a problem that has been scientifically defined in a wrong way. But I'll elaborate on that some other time. But it's a welcome addition to the discourse. Before I let you guys go, so, you've been on the show, both of you, multiple times. Pranay, you too are like here almost every third week because at the pace with which you write books. But so I can't ask you for overall recommendations about the things that you have loved most in your life. But since you guys last came, what is top of mind? What books, films, music have you been particularly impressed by recently?
I'll begin quickly. Three things. So, I would recommend a Mandarin movie called Upstream, which is a very nice movie on delivery workers in Shanghai, and nicely done movie released last year. On books, as I was telling you, Amit, Manohar Malgaonkar's books I have been trying to look at. He used to write novels long ago, but I have discovered him now because reprints of his books have come out in the last 2-3 years. So there's a book called The Seahawk on the Maratha Navy and Kanoji Angres Navy, very nicely written for people who are interested. And listening, apart from Seen and Unseen, I've been listening to Ideas of India, of course, and Manoj, our common friend, has a podcast called The Great Power Show. So people who are interested in geopolitics, for them it's really a fun podcast. So these are my 3 recommendations.
This is a super Manoj Kevalramani he refers to, who's been on my show a number of times and absolutely one of the best thinkers in China in the whole wide world, if not the best. Love that guy.
Just on Manohar Malgaonkar, for some strange reason, he was a very popular author in our engineering college days. So, Fire on the Mountain, there are other books that are fairly good. And surprisingly, I never found him again elsewhere. Like nobody was ever reading him. There was a period of time when I saw a lot of people reading him, but then after that, it seemed to have all disappeared. On recommendations, movie recommendations are quite a few. I mean that I've been watching over the last year or so, which is something that people can take. I think I'll possibly talk of a few that are somewhat less known, so that people might have a look at them. So there is this movie called May December, which is I think now it's available in some of these streaming platforms, which is quite good. It's actually based on a real life case of a teacher falling in love with a student and going to prison because of that, and then she comes out and actually marries that boy, and then there's a life around that, and then the movie is about someone wanting to portray that person as an actor and going to them and then seeing their life and figuring things out with them. So that was kind of interesting. I mean, if you like sort of drama that's a bit slow and goes easy. Hard Truths is another one which I saw, a movie that has Marianne Jean-Baptiste. She was there in a movie almost 30 years back called Secret and Lies, where she's a young black person who goes around searching because she was adopted, so goes searching for who her real parents were and discovers that her mother was a white person, and that triggers off another story. So this is the same director who's made this with a very different Marianne Jean-Baptiste, who's one of the great actors of her time. So that again, I don't know whether it's available somewhere, but if people get a chance somewhere to see this, or if the video comes, or if it comes somewhere on an OTT platform, please watch it. Real Pain, which got a little bit of Oscar news because the one of them, I mean, this Culkin guy won the Best Supporting Actor, and it's a great movie about two cousins, both Jews, whose grandmother left them some money with a specific instruction after she passed away that in her will that they should go visit Poland, which is where she came from, and she was a Holocaust survivor. So these two boys, Jesse Eisenberg and Kieran Culkin. Kieran Culkin is the guy who was there in Succession as Roman Roy, and Jesse Eisenberg, the Social Network, he was Zuckerberg. So they go to Poland. It's kind of funny slice of life kind of a thing, but quite well written. So those are the movies. Book reading has been somewhat sporadic, and sometimes reading old stuff, new stuff, different stuff at times. So I read The Orbital by Samantha Harvey. She won the Booker last year, which was quite good. Right now, actually, I'm reading what Amit gave me, How Music Works by David Byrne. It's right here. Quite a good book, very, very interesting book. And I'll not tell you reasons, but I'm also reading Visual Arts in the 20th Century. This is as detailed a book on every single art movement of the 20th century, with very nice reprints of some of the great works of art of the 20th century, which is great, which is absolutely a fantastic book. Um, so those are the three things right now next to me, next to my bedside table. So yeah, so those are some of the recommendations.
Thanks so much. This episode has cost me a lot of money because I'll be going out and buying all of this now. So thank you for that. But it's all for a larger cause. So yeah, it was great talking to you, and I love reading your newsletter. The recommendations I would give are basically the great podcast Pulyabazi by Pranay Kotasthane plus friends. They are all awesome, wonderful discussions. In fact, you even had a great Hindi discussion on the caste census, as it were. And of course, a newsletter written by Pranay and RHA, which is brilliant. Their book on public policy is magnificent. I had an episode with them on that as well. So thank you guys. This was it was very quick. It feels like matlab hi hello mein khatam ho gaya, but thank you guys. This
There's
was
actually
great.
one point, sometime back, Pranay and I were thinking about, what is the next book what's the topic on which we'll write the next book? And we've been sort of throwing back ideas and so on and so forth. I think I mentioned it to him almost a year and a half back. I was telling him that we should write a book which starts off with Rajiv Goswami immolating himself, and then talk about caste, and talk about it in all various ways and forms, and maybe this is a good trigger for us to think about that that book.
I would love to read that book and have you guys on again. I mean, maybe this is a spark that lights that fire.
Yeah, I
So
think so.
go for it, guys.
All
Thanks
right,
so much.
thank you.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, check out the show notes, enter rabbit holes at will. You can follow Pranay on Twitter at Pranay Kotas. RHJ, of course, being pseudonymous, does not have an account there. You can follow me on Twitter at Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in and every podcast app of your choice. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.